Good morning, Team Alabama. Here is a little more of the Diary of Anne Frank. Please turn in your Chromebooks to page 529 and read along with me. Page 529 and read along with me, please. It is evening after supper. From outside we hear the sound of children playing. The grown-ups, with the exception of Mr. Van Daan, are all in the main room. Mrs. Frank is doing some mending, meaning she's sewing. Mrs. Van Daan is reading a fashion magazine. Mr. Frank is going over business accounts. Dussel, in his dentist jacket, is pacing up and down, impatient to get into his bedroom. Mr. Van Daan is upstairs working on a piece of embroidery in an embroidery frame. In his room, Peter is sitting before the mirror, smoothing his hair. As the scene goes on, he puts on his tie, brushes his coat, and puts it on, preparing himself meticulously. And go ahead and add that word to your vocab. Meticulously means with a lot of attention, like he's getting himself fixed up for a visit from Anne. So their relationship is changing. On his wall are now hung some of Anne's motion picture stars. In her room, Anne too is getting dressed. She stands before the mirror in her slip, trying various ways of dressing her hair. Okay, dressing is kind of an old-fashioned term for fixing her hair. She's kind of fixing herself up to go see Peter. Okay, Margot is seated on the sofa, hemming a skirt for Anne to wear. In the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer, and he comes over, rapping sharply on the door, knocking on Anne's bedroom. Anne calling to him, "No, Mr. Dussel, I am not dressed yet." Dussel walks away furious, sitting down and burying his head in his hands. Anne turns to Margot. "How is that? How does that look?" Margot, glancing at her briefly. "Fine. You didn't even look." "Of course I did. It's fine." "Margot, tell me, am I terribly ugly?" "Oh, stop fishing." No, tell me." "Of course you're not. You've got nice eyes and a lot of animation and a little vague, aren't you?" Vague meaning not clear. She reaches over and takes a brassiere, or a bra, out of Margot's sewing basket, and she holds it up to herself, studying the effects in the mirror. Outside, Mrs. Frank, feeling sorry for Mr. Dussel, comes over, knocking on the girl's door. Mrs. Frank outside. "May I come in?" "Come in, Mother." Mrs. Frank shutting the door behind her. Mr. Dussel's impatient to get in here. Anne, still with the brassiere, or bra. "Heavens, he takes the room for himself the entire day." Mrs. Frank gently. "Anne, dear, you're not going in again tonight to see Peter." Anne, dignified. "That is my intention." Mrs. Frank. "But you've already spent a great deal of time in there today." "I was in there exactly twice. Once to get the dictionary, and then 3/4 of an hour before supper." Mrs. Frank. "Aren't you afraid you're disturbing him?" Mother. "I have some intuition." Mrs. Frank. "Then may I ask you this much, Anne? Please don't shut the door when you go in. You sound like Mrs. Van Daan." She throws the brassiere back in Margot's sewing basket and picks up her blouse, putting it on. Mrs. Frank. No, I don't mean to suggest anything wrong. I only wish that you wouldn't expose yourself to criticism. That you wouldn't give Mrs. Van Daan the opportunity to be unpleasant. Mrs. Van Daan doesn't need any opportunity to be unpleasant. Everyone's on edge, worried about Mr. Kraler. This is one more thing. "I'm sorry, Mother, but I'm going to Peter's room. I'm not going to let Petronella Van Daan spoil our friendship." Mrs. Frank hesitates for a second and then goes out, closing the door after her, and she gets a pack of playing cards and sits at the center table playing solitaire. In Anne's room, Margot hands the finished skirt to Anne, and as Anne is putting it on, Margot takes off her high-heeled shoes and stuffs paper in the toes so that Anne can wear them. Margot to Anne. "Why don't you two talk in the main room? It'd save a lot of trouble. It's hard on Mother having to listen to those remarks from Mrs. Van Daan and not say a word." "Why doesn't she say a word?" "I think it's ridiculous to take it. You don't understand Mother at all, do you? She can't talk back. She's not like you. It's just not in her nature to fight back." Anyway, the only one I worry about is you. I feel awfully guilty about you. She sits on the stool near Margot, putting on Margot's high-heeled shoes. What about? I mean, every time I go into Peter's room, I have a feeling I may be hurting you. Margot shakes her head. I know if it were me, I'd be wild. I'd be desperately jealous if it were me. Well, I'm not. You don't feel badly? Really? Truly? You're not jealous? Of course I'm jealous. Jealous that you've got someone to get up in the morning for, but jealous of you and Peter? No. Anne goes back to the mirror. Maybe there's nothing to be jealous of. Maybe he doesn't really like me. Maybe I'm just taking the place of his cat. She picks up a pair of short white gloves and putting them on. Wouldn't you like to come in with us? I have a book. The sound of children playing outside fades out, and in the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer, and he jumps up, going to the door and knocking sharply. Will you please let me in my room? Just a minute, dear Mr. Dussel. She picks up Mr. Mother's pink stole and adjusts it elegantly over her shoulders, and then gives a last look in the mirror. Well, here I go to run the gauntlet. And she starts out, followed by Margot. Okay, to run the gauntlet. It basically means to endure a series of troubles or difficulties. Basically, she's going to have to pass through the living room, and everybody's going to stare at her before she goes into Peter's room. And everybody's kind of giving her grief or making fun of her for spending so much time with Peter. Dussel, as she appears sarcastic, thank you so much. Dussel goes into his room, and Anne goes towards Peter's room, passing Mrs. Van Daan and her parents at the center table. My God, look at her, says Mrs. Van Daan. Anne pays no attention, and she knocks at Peter's door. I don't know what good it is to have a son. I never see him. He wouldn't care if I killed myself. Peter opens the door and stands aside for Anne to come in. Just a minute, Anne. She goes to them at the door. I'd like to say a few words to my son. Do you mind? Peter and Anne stand waiting. Peter, I don't want you staying up until all hours tonight. You've got to have your sleep. You're a growing boy. You hear? Anne won't stay late. She's going to bed promptly at 9, says Mrs. Frank. Aren't you, Anne? Yes, Mother, to Mrs. Van Daan. May we go now? Mrs. Van Daan, are you asking me? I didn't know I had anything to say about it. Mrs. Frank, listen for the chimes, Anne dear. The two young people go off into Peter's room, shutting the door after them.